Hello, and welcome to our webinar, People-Centered Design Principles for AI Implementation. I'm Allie McDonald, a senior editor at MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be your moderator today. The audio for this event will be recorded and will be available to all attendees approximately 3 to 4 business days after the end of the live event. We welcome your questions for our speakers today. To submit questions, please enter them anytime in the questions module on the GoToWebinar control panel, or you can submit questions on Twitter using the hashtag MITSMRevent. We'll answer as many questions as time permits in the hour. If you're having audio or other difficulties, please check the help link in the upper part of your console. Our speakers today are Wang and David Bray. Ray is CEO of Constellation Research in Palo Alto, California, and David is the Executive Director of the People-Centered Internet Coalition and Senior Fellow at the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition. Our thanks go out to SAS for their sponsorship of this webinar. David and Ray were looking forward to this discussion today, and we're talking about people-centered design principles for AI implementation. To start off, we actually want to hear from you, our audience, first, and we have a poll question for you to answer. This question is, what stage of AI adoption is your organization in? You can choose from the following options, which are, you're just starting to explore, you have funded an initiative, or you are using AI in your organization now. So Ray and David, based off your experience, where do you think most organizations are positioned currently?
Ray, do you want to take that one first, or would you like me to?
Yeah, go ahead.
So first, thanks, Ali, for the opportunity. And my perception is it's kind of an interesting dichotomy where probably a lot of people feel like they're not fully embracing AI, or they haven't really put their toes in the water yet. But I think when they really begin to look underneath the hood, some things that they may not be calling AI, that may be either expert systems or decision support systems that are sort of the previous wave of what AI was in the 70s and 80s. They are using those systems. I mean, even just sort of intelligent sort of search or business analytics. And so it's this interesting thing where probably people feel like they really haven't fully embraced this most recent wave. But I think when they actually sort of look underneath the hood as what they're doing, they would be surprised at some of the things that they would not consider to have some dimension of AI, they probably already are. Ray, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think what is happening is people are using AI in different ways. The catch-all of AI is such a broad category. What they're starting to realize is that they're seeing different levels of AI being used, and the exploration part is happening. We just did a survey of 80 early adopters, and it's the same thing. They've just begun the process. They're getting to see some levels of ROI, but they know there's a lot more, and there's a lot more ahead of them. So it's going to be very exciting.
Terrific. Well, that's really helpful to know some of your own experience with this. And then based off of our poll results that are now in, it looks like 2/3 of our audience are just starting to explore. 12% have funded an initiative, and then 20% are actually using AI in the organization currently. So that's also encouraging too. So that sets us up very well. So I will turn it over to you, Ray and David, for your presentation.
Yeah, hey, thanks a lot. So let's spend some time talking about where AI is. We're going to talk about the progression. And so let's move to the next slide where we can talk about where we are on this path to AI. Now, one of the interesting things about this path to AI is that AI is often known through many different names and different categories. And the way we're using AI right now in this conversation loosely is to talk about a category of different ways that are getting us to augmented or artificial intelligence. Now, most people are starting out with predictive analytics, big data. That's the foundation. But then over time, what we're going to do is we add machine learning, and we will get to, at some point, the neural networks, the cognitive computing, and then way, way out at some point, narrow AI and general artificial intelligence. Now, what is hot at this moment really is the predictive analytics and big data, bringing that data, assembling it in a place where it then can be used. And then, of course, the machine learning as we apply different algorithms and patterns so that we can understand what's in that data. Most people have lots of data. It's not about having more data. It's about getting better insight. And what we're trying to do is go from data to decisions. And in that process of going from data to decisions, what we're thinking about is how do we take that data, How do we align that to business processes? Order to cash, hire to retire, incident to resolution, campaign to lead. And once we align them with those business processes, we take those information flows and we start looking for patterns. Once we find those patterns, then we have something we can take action against. And so we go from data to information flows to insight, and then insight to action. And that's the data to decisions paradigm that we're trying to do. The techniques over time are coming through predictive analytics and big data, machine learning, neural networks, and cognitive computing. And then over time, these systems will start becoming autonomous and building themselves, their narrow AI and the general AI. So, David, anything you want to add to that as well?
I think you definitely highlighted the progression of sort of how people can move further up the chain to more sophisticated approaches to using AI. I think the other dimension I would add to folks would be to recognize that we've been through different waves of AI. That going back to the 1950s with Herbert Simon and some others, that first wave of AI really was trying to create programs and algorithms that could basically play games or perform human tasks as good as humans. And that was obviously something that even to this day, I mean, we now look at what's happened both with chess, but also now with Go and other more complex games. We seem to have made huge strides in that area. And then fast forward to the second wave of AI, that was the 1970s, 1980s. That's where it was really looking at sort of the idea of what was called expert systems. Could a machine, if you told it enough rules, answer as good as a human expert in terms of whether it was healthcare, trying to do identification of, say, cardiovascular disease, cancer cells, but also what was called decision support systems and group decision support systems. And that wave was really trying to figure out how you could collectively make decisions better as a group with the AI also being present. And so we continue to see strides with that as well. The most recent in the area in terms of diseases of the eye, they've now been able to actually, in just the last 2 years, create algorithms that can actually be better than the top 5% or more doctors in the world at identifying diseases of the eye by doing retinal scans and other images. So really this third wave, which is really sort of the idea of machine learning, neural networks, and what goes from beyond there, this has really become possible in part because of cloud computing and other computational capabilities. We now have the storage, we now have the memory to do what was, quite frankly, algorithms that were identified in the 80s, but just weren't feasible because we didn't have the cloud surface and the cloud infrastructure necessary to do this now. And it's just worth noting that we'll probably see other ways of AI in the future as well, but we're right now experiencing what I would call the third wave of AI.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, this has been around for a long time, and you can take the algorithms that were developed in the 80s that didn't have the compute power and test them, and a lot of people are doing that right now. And so a lot of the algorithms are there. Now, what's interesting about this, as we go to the next slide, is what you're going to see is really 4 things that people are trying to accomplish with AI. One is a level of automation. As you can tell, that's a Tesla plant. But the funny thing about this automation in this Tesla plant is while this looks like a fully automated plant, they decided that they needed to add more people to improve quality. Yes, like I said that. They actually added more humans to improve quality because there's only certain things machines can do. They'll do it exactly the way they're being told. But that level of automation allowed them to free up employees to become more strategic so that they could actually think about what else to do or how they could actually improve quality while those machines were there. Now, if we go to the next slide, what you're going to see is this notion of augmentation. And so after you get to a level of automation, you're thinking, well, what else can we do? And that augmentation is really talking about the fact that we are now able to build upon those skills, build on that so that we can do more. And a lot of the notion of having artificial intelligence in place is allowing us to think outside of the box, apply these algorithms, apply these new tools so that you have time to actually do more. It's not going to make a decision for you, but it's going to help you make a faster decision. And then the second to last one is discovery. And what's interesting about discovery is it's about our ability to find patterns that we wouldn't have seen before. You apply a topological data analysis and suddenly you discover there were patterns that you didn't see before, right? They're kind of interesting clusters that wouldn't have been found. Well, that discovery is great on multiple fronts in identifying new things, but also being used to identify areas from fraud to threat detection to security. And these are kind of in place in a continuous level. And then the last one is really about risk mitigation and compliance, right? And what we see in this risk mitigation and compliance is the ability to really identify those threats, and in some cases prevent a threat, and in other cases making sure that you're compliant with a lot of regulations. Compliance is a big area, and also reduction of risk is also a big area that we see in businesses. And so this really is kind of a great way to think of the business rationale to think about AI. But when we actually go to understanding what people are doing, there's a progression of actually outcomes that occur. And so on this next slide, what you see is really we think about 7 business outcomes that occur with AI. We start by understanding, hey, what's happening in front of us? That's perception. And so perception actually has replicated all 5 senses. Our ability to see, hear, smell, touch, that is actually happening right now, and it's being digitized. As that gets digitized, we want to understand what's happening. Give me an alert. Give me a workflow. Give me a task. What is that notification, right? And so we start by identifying those notifications. And then over time, we realize there are patterns, and we say, make a recommendation for us, make a suggestion. And then over time, we can start automating them. Now, the automation is going to be hard, but it's going to happen, right? We're going to be able to figure out our false positives, our false negatives. We're going to understand why those exist. And over time, that training is going to happen. And when we get to that training, we can get to precision decisions in that automation portion. When we have some level of automation, we get better at the prediction aspects. So what can we expect to happen? Our prediction, our planning, our forecasting, that becomes a huge area. And then prevention is the one where we actually see the most opportunity. In prevention, you have the ability to do the risk mitigation. I'll give you a great example. I'm not going to pick on a brand, but there was a famous phone that basically you heard in every airport that was banned. And part of the reason was 140 phones actually had batteries that caught on fire. Now let's think about it. 140 phones for this manufacturer was really 8 sigma in quality. 8 sigma in quality, which is like 99.99999. 8 sigma in quality took out $8 billion for this manufacturer over an 8-week recall. Imagine if I could apply machine learning and AI to identify the root cause of that issue. And if I could go from 8 weeks to 1 week, that would have been $1 billion recall. If I could go from 1 week to 1 day, that might have been $100 million recall. What's $5 to $10 million on an AI project to prevent a $100 million recall or even an $8 billion recall? That's the power, and that's how you build the business case. Really, prevention we see is one of the huge areas. And then the last case, we may get to somewhere where we're actually going to have situational awareness, but we're probably talking 10 to 20 years out here. So, or maybe sooner. What do you think, David?
Yes, I mean, I think we need to recognize that AI has gone through both periods of heated interest as well as what it was called AI winters. And so some of these things that we're talking about are probably 20, 25 years out. At the same time, if an organization doesn't start the journey now with some of the more early technologies, in particular, using the data they have, rationalizing the data they have, making it so that it's even understandable by a machine, if they wait too long, others will actually disrupt and actually gain the leapfrog ahead. And so it's one of those things that the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. We should recognize that just because some of these things are more on the horizon for 20 or 25 years from now, we do have to start the journey now with the things that require us to make sense of our enterprise, make sense of our processes, and make sense of the data we have.
Great. Thank you so much, David and Ray. So as we get into this next portion of their presentation, which will be getting more into what people-centered AI means for organizations, we have another poll question for the audience. So that question is, how important is it that your organization is people-centered? The options being, is it very important, somewhat important, or not something that the organization has considered yet? So again, we'll give everyone a couple of moments to respond. And Ray and David, what are the common reactions that you receive when posing this question in organizations?
Yeah, I would start by saying that people-centered approach is kind of a design thinking philosophy, starting by thinking about how you put the individual at the center of that design thinking process. I'll let David jump in with more details, but I think just so people have context as they're thinking about this poll.
Yes, and building on what Ray said, I mean, So Doug Engelbart, who is well known, if he's known as being the inventor of the computer mouse, but he's done way much more than that. Back more than 50 years ago in 1969, he gave the mother of all demos, which actually demonstrated the graphical user interface. He demonstrated the idea of file versioning, the fact that you could talk to a computer, or the goal that you could talk to a computer, and actually the initial mouse that he built was actually a wooden mouse, and really it was this idea that technology should recognize the ways that humans can interact with it so that it's actually not that foreign to us. And you have to remember, of course, back then, 1960s, you were mainly dealing with punch cards as the interface for both feeding in programs, and definitely graphical user interfaces were not something that was a reality yet. And I raise that because he also had the vision that what technology could do is it could actually augment human capabilities, and more importantly, overcome the challenges of what he called the need for communities to learn and adapt. The recognition that in the way going forward, if we actually had this internetworking technology, at the time it wasn't called the internet because the internet wasn't there yet, but this ability to share insights and learn from that different communities could try different things and learn from there and adapt. And so when we talk about people-centered, it really is trying to extend that vision that Doug Engelbart had, which is the idea that technology should be amplifying those that are human strengths, recognizing and possibly adapting those which are human weaknesses or human biases or human challenges, and really about both the individual and the community as a whole. And so if you're in a business context, it's thinking about who are your communities that you are trying to engage with, how you make sure that it's actually something that's community-centric, not just a point of sale or just a transaction. If you're in a case of a nonprofit or a government organization, how do you engage your stakeholders, your shareholders, in a way that is actually empowering of them as opposed to necessarily distancing them or having them not feel like they're part of the process. And regardless of whatever type of organization you are, it really is trying to figure out, when we talk about people-centered AI, the idea that AI is something that's done with a community as opposed to done to a community, or something where they don't feel like they have some involvement in how it's designed and how it's implemented. So I'd be interested in the poll results if you can actually share them with us, Allie.
Yes, so I good timing, and that's really helpful context for understanding, what you're talking about when you're saying people-centered, being sort of, across external and internal considerations. So the poll results are in, and encouragingly, 78% say that this is very important within their organizations. 15% have reported that it's somewhat important, and 7% are saying that this isn't something that the organization has considered yet. So that's helpful as we get into this next portion of the presentation, and I will turn it back to you both.
Thank you. All right, so now as we move forward, what we want to really share with you are things that you can do in your organization now to have people-centered approaches to data and the implementation of AI. And the first thing that we need to recognize, because there's been a lot of conversations, and you've seen some rather interesting figures on social media and things like that, try and debate whether or not AI is good or bad. Is it going to be the end of all humanity or not? And I would say that at the end of the day, we need to recognize that there's two things. And Ray, I think you would agree too, is that first, we've got 3,000 years of human philosophy, 3,000 plus years, and we still haven't agreed on a universal set of ethics. I don't think somehow miraculously AI is going to be the thing that brings us all together and we figure out a common set of ethics for the world as a whole. So I think we need to recognize that that's going to be challenging. And I'd also go even further to say the challenges of talking about AI ethics, while good and noble, needs to recognize that at the end of the day, AI in some respects, especially this third wave of machine learning and neural networks and deep learning, it's only as good as the data that's actually fed into the machine. If the data itself has biases that you don't want, or it's not representative of the questions you're trying to ask, or the way you collected the data, or the way you implement the decisions from the machine themselves is not ethical, then conversation of AI ethical itself is actually very challenging. And so these are all things that we need to think about when we try to move forward, when we're trying to think about how to do people-centered approaches to AI. Ray, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And I think that what we have to understand is, given the fact that people have very different outcomes and views, these ethics are going to be different in every country, every value set, and so you do have to account for it. We always have this funny question, like, if who lives if two autonomous vehicles get into a crash, right? Is it the doctor? Is it the politician? Is it the banker? Is it the single mother with 3 kids? Is it the teenager? Is it the teenage sports star, right? Is it the policeman or first responder, right? And it's a crazy question, right? Because like who gets to decide? Do we play God in that? And it actually is a very simple answer. I'll let you guys think about this. But if we know there's going to be an accident and we know who's going to be in those vehicles for that accident, why don't you tell them to stay home and then send the cars out and let them have the accident? So, but it's nothing's that easy, right? It's going to be very difficult. So, but let's talk about the things that we've been talking about, how people can build these design principles in AI and get these early in so that we can avoid and actually prevent any kind of overt ethical issues.
Sure, and I think that's really what we're striving to, is recognizing that at the end of the day, ethics, it's worth distinguishing that there's ethics, which is socially defined, it's normative, it's social. Morals are actually what you internally determine if they're good or bad. And it's worth noting that there's times when ethics and morals can actually be in conflict with each other. For example, for some parts of the world, in the US, it may be unethical for a physician to assist someone even if they have 4th-stage cancer or something like that, with ending their life. That would be unethical by different professional societies. And at the same time, morally, the physician may actually respect that actually a patient wants to, in their 4th stage, to have that dignity to pass away. But that points out that morals and ethics can be in conflict, and that ethics are socially defined. There's also been interesting research that shows it takes, in general, 10 to 20 years for humans to actually sort through ethics of any new technology. That's about a generation. And it's worth pointing out that back in World War I, supposedly, the British actually thought that submarines were unethical forms of warfare because they were underneath the water. Fast forward to World War II, we know how that almost played out, in the sense that the British were not as far advanced in using submarines as other countries were, and World War II might have taken a different stand. So really what we're trying to do is separate from the conversations of ethics and morals, what organizations can do just to, in general, be always in a learning mode as these technologies move forward and as societies figure out how they want to use them in a people-centered way. And the first principle we want to espouse is transparency. Specifically, wherever possible, share the high-level implementation details of what you're trying to do. I always think about this as we already have, especially for for-profit companies, you have to do 10K filings. It would really be great if we had something similar. You don't have to do it, but you do something similar where you say, here are the different data sets, again, not detailing them to the table and row level, but really just saying we're bringing in data of this different types. We're bringing them together to actually run, whether it's a neural network, maybe it's a deep learning assessment or something like that, whatever it is, share the approach and say we're doing this to reach decisions involving X, Y, and Z. And that sort of transparency at least helps people understand what you're trying to do and also what you're not trying to do. And so it can help remove some of the suspicions or the doubt that's out there and actually engender trust. Ray, do you have thoughts?
I definitely agree with you, and I think transparency is one of those things that we put it out there because you want people to understand that if you get to a point where there's some level of bias or there's some level of like an algorithm that's being tested or being able to figure out what's happening, you want people to be able to freely test it, really see what's going on, and I think that helps with the other two that we're talking about later.
Yes, and one thing I wanted to say to add on to transparency is the idea that really that there may be cases where maybe you're dealing with proprietary information, you're dealing with sensitive information, and the data itself may involve some privacy, and that needs to be respected as well. And so the solution there might be you include a panel of outside experts that do a non-disclosure agreement or something like that, where they're brought in and they're serving as outside observers to make sure you're doing the right thing and serve as that second or third pair of eyes. But they're also recognizing that you can't necessarily disclose all the data you're using because some of it may be proprietary or sensitive. So now, as for the next principle we're trying to recommend is that of explainability. And recognizing that this gets a little bit challenging because a lot of the current ways that we're using AI, especially with machine learning and the idea that it's feeding in enough data and helping the machine find patterns to that data in ways that humans just really couldn't do as quickly or as at same scale. Explainability is really trying to help people understand what is the data set coming in, the different data sets that are being brought in, and the decisions being made from that. So you may not be able to specifically say why the machine is now keying into now's a good time to do X or buy Y or invest in Z, but you can at least say, we've brought these data sets in, here's how we're using them, here's how often we're refreshing them, and then here are the decisions we're driving from that. Ray, do you have thoughts from what you've seen in the field?
Yeah, and the one thing I would add is, look, bias is not a bad thing. You make decisions based on factors. So it's okay if it's explicit bias and you're okay with it. But what explainability does, it also helps you uncover unexpected bias and unintended bias. And when you do something, let's say we discriminate against left-handers with like purple hair, and you don't know why, and you didn't intend to do that, that becomes a problem. And that's why explainability is important.
Yes, and actually to emphasize what Ray was saying, you need to recognize that when you are training a AI implementation, you are actually training it to have a bias, and that's actually how it becomes an expert. But what you need to do is make sure you're intentional in the biases you want to have present versus the unconscious biases or the social biases that you don't want to bring in. For example, we know already in our current society, there is unfairness in how people are paid based on either demographics involving gender or race or even height. And unfortunately, the taller you are, the more you're paid, which maybe makes sense if you're a basketball player, but probably for most professions that doesn't make sense. And so being intentional about what biases range. Yeah, you never know. But I raise that because when you teach a machine to become an expert, it is developing biases, but what you want to do, make sure, is that you're explaining which biases you want and what you're doing to try and actually not incorporate those biases you don't want to continue.
Which drives us to our next point, which is really important. Yeah, exactly.
Go ahead, Ray. You can do this one.
I was gonna say it drives us to our next point, which is very important, which is the ability to undo that bias, right? So how do we reverse this, right? We've gone out and said, oh yeah, okay, left-handers with purple hair, yeah, we don't want those. Wait, that's wrong. How do we fix that? Right, and that's really what reversibility is about.
Yes, and I think it's recognizing that in some respects, this may actually be where AI can overcome human weaknesses, because even as humans, it's hard for us to unlearn something, even when we become consciously made aware of it. I often ask people, and actually the listeners on the call can do this experiment right now, which is I'd ask you to cross your arms. And once you've crossed your arms, if you could then do the reverse and cross them the other way. And you'll find that feels a little bit difficult. That feels a little bit odd. There's also examples where people are given a bicycle, except the only difference is the bicycle, instead of turning the way that you're using it, to the left or right, it does the exact opposite. People think that would be easy, but in fact, they find that's very hard. And so reversibility is actually something that we humans actually have challenges with. And we just need to make sure that when we start to use machines to make decisions and automate certain things in the workplace and other organizations, that we need to be able to unlearn things if something that the machine has reached a conclusion on is not something that we want to continue. So this then leads to, what are the 3 steps? If those are the 3 principles, what are the 3 things that you can do in an organization? And the first that we want to actually advocate for is actually having data advocates. You need to recognize that if garbage in, garbage out, that's a term from computer science, that if the data itself is not representative and diverse of the questions you want to ask of it, the AI implementation itself is going to be flawed. And so this is something, the question is, whose responsibility is this? I know some organizations have created chief data officers. While I think that's an interesting step, that's putting it all on the shoulders of one person, when in fact, it really needs to be stakeholders from across the entire organization. Because while the data officer may have, or data scientist may have a lot of expertise, the different business units will actually understand their data better because they're at the edge of how it's being done. And so it's really trying to think about who in your organization takes responsibility for understanding the quality of their data, possibly even understanding the risk of your data, because it could be if the data itself has personal information in it or sensitive information, that if there was a breach or something like that. Having data advocates not only helps you do AI implementations better, but it actually helps you improve the risk profile of your organization as a whole, to actually buy down that risk if there's sensitive information or data that really, quite frankly, you should actually find ways of appropriately removing from an organization because maybe it's out of date or it's not something that you need to hold on to anymore. Ray, you have thoughts?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you. And I think having data advocates, I mean, you can make every role a data advocate. It's not just someone that's in tech or someone that's, traditionally working with the data. It's everyone in the business side as well. So something to think about in functions: a finance data advocate, a customer data advocate, an HR data advocate. So just think about it. It's cross-functional.
So, and again, steps that you can do with them: consider actually having your data advocates across the organization work on a code of ethics that's people-centered, and actually have ways for people to elevate their concerns within your organization, both outside your organization as they concerns about your products or your services, but also internally as well. Also think about how we can actually do this all together. And as Ray and I are both trying to emphasize, at the end of the day, we are the cavalry. It's got to be all of us. It cannot be relegated to just a few people in the organization. This now leads to then the next step that we recommend to people, which is called mindful monitoring. And really what mindful monitoring is the idea that you need to think about different pools of data. There's really going to be 3 pools of data. The first pool of data is that which is the trusted data that you're currently using to train your AI implementation. It's data that you consider, having gone through some process of review, you consider it's good enough to teach the machine to begin to reach conclusions and make recommendations as to what your organization is going to do. But then there's also 2 separate other pools as well. There's a queued pool, which is potentially worthwhile data that you've not formally vetted whether or not it should become trusted or not. And then there's also a naysayer pool, which is really trying to help sort of identify that data which is maybe out of date, maybe data is no longer relevant, maybe market conditions have changed or organization conditions have changed, or unreliable data. And this is increasingly important because unfortunately, as we've seen already, it's increasingly possible to generate large amounts, whether it's data, text, audio, or video, that quite frankly isn't real or is fake. And this could be done either intentionally or unintentionally. But if organizations aren't careful, if they start doing AI implementations and they're not vetting their data, whether it should go in the trusted pool or not, or whether it's no longer reliable, they may find they teach their machine things that are actually dubious at best, or actually lead it down a blind alley. And so to sort of put this in a table form, again, we're talking about the data pool that is trusted. That's the data that's actually vetted to fit your AI training systems. And then the 2 other ones, again, queued data. It's data that might be useful but has not formally been vetted. And then the naysayer pool that's unfit. It's actually trying to actually say, devil's advocate, this data is out of date. So Ray, do you have thoughts on this as well?
I think that's important. It's mindful monitoring is something that people haven't always thought through. And I think you also want to take in mind that, data isn't necessarily good or bad or high quality or low quality. You have to just think about data being purposeful. Like, does it solve the purpose of what it's doing? Because folks that are data advocates and data oriented to begin with, they know that they capture all the data, because you never know if you need to use it somewhere at some point in time. And so that's something to think about as well.
Right, and I think you hit the nail on the head, Ray. That we see some people that say, well, why don't you just discard the data at the point of collection, because maybe it's not relevant, or it's maybe it's not useful, maybe it's even obscene or something like that. And the challenge is at the point of collection, it's really hard to determine whether something is relevant or not. And in some respects, it may not be relevant at that moment, but it may be 6 months later, 12 months later. And so you hit the nail on the head that oftentimes organizations are collecting the data, but what we're saying is don't automatically pull that into your trusted pool just because you collected it, and then have some process to decide whether it goes into the trusted pool or it gets discarded, or it gets put into the naysayer pool and said, yeah, it's not relevant right now, maybe it will be in the future, or we don't think this will always ever be relevant. But that sort of thinking through, you need to recognize that if you're not careful, your organization itself may actually find that misinformation, disinformation is not something that just impacts humans, but could impact your AI system as well. And that leads to the final and third thing that people can do is actually provide bounded expectations for your whether it's your outside community, your shareholders, your stakeholders, they need to understand how the data sets are being used to train AI in a way that can be informed, can actually be listed as to what they're doing. This sort of idea it builds upon what we were already talking about, which is have data advocates, have people that are actually championing how data is used in your organization, but it's going a step forward, almost like a recommended daily allowance food list of things that are being done with this data in this company include the following. And it's making that visible in a way that can be seen by others. Ray, you have thoughts as well?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you there. I think these bounded expectations are important. One of the things that you're going to realize that a great place to actually start with AI and train with AI is in heavily regulated industries like healthcare or financial services, or insurance. Those are great places because the expectations are bounded and you can and very well defined. So I think that helps a lot.
Yes. And to give our audience a sort of a framework to help sort of think through your bounded expectations, I'm going to recommend what's called the Auris Framework. And the Auris Framework really is just sort of 4 questions. The first of which is what are your obligations to society, to your customers, to the public, in terms of the AI implementation? And we can think of cases where maybe there's some high-profile large companies that may have been so focused on their bottom line that they didn't think about the overall picture about how what they're doing might impact not just their bottom line and not just their customers, but the general social cohesion, general trust in society, trust in governments, things like that. That it's worth doing at least a 360. What are your obligations, not just to your bottom line and your board, but what are your overall obligations to your shareholders, stakeholders, and society as a whole? Once you've done that, then the next is the A, which is acknowledge unknowns. These are your biases. These are things that you don't really have the ability to see, maybe because you don't have complete clairvoyance in the future. In fact, I don't think any of us do. Maybe it's the recognition that you're coming from a perspective that is maybe US centric or European centric or Asian centric, or maybe it's that you're familiar with your current market, but you're not familiar with other sectors that you might spill over to or start to work with as well. But whatever it is, recognize that we all have biases in part because we're experts in certain things, but by becoming experts, we also have blinders to other things as well. And then from there, the 2 remaining steps are the R for responsible actions. Based on your obligations to societies and based on your acknowledged unknowns, what are the proactive things you want to do with your AI implementation so that you're always going to be learning? I think that is so important because the reality is, again, technology is moving quickly, society is moving quickly, there are ripple effects that are happening. We always have to be learning, and what you plan for today will probably change and adjust not just in 6 months and 12 months, but 18 months and 24 months onwards. And then finally, the S is for safeguards. Again, we've already given you some ideas, which is safeguards can include a data advocacy function, a way of always being listening to your outside stakeholders, include outside people that can actually provide input. But together, this simple framework of identifying your bounded expectations with regards to your obligations to society, your acknowledged unknowns, your responsible actions with the AI implementation, and your safeguards can at least put you miles, if not light years ahead of others when it comes to being people-centered in your AI implementation. And the last thing to we'll end with, before we go to a poll here actually, is think about having an Ombuds function. I mean, we've seen Ombuds functions for other things in the past, but really this is a way where as you grow and move forward in your AI implementation, have a function where concerns, opportunities, risks can be raised and be shared with your board, and involve both your board and your outsiders on thinking about how the data you're using, how the things you are producing using your AI services impact people. Ray, thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think the important part here is when we think about this and we apply these design principles, the most important part is to humanize AI. One of the interesting things we've learned over time is that it's artificial intelligence isn't there to replace us. It's not us really learning from the AI. It's actually the AI is learning from us. And it's an inverted approach when you think about this.
Terrific. Well, thank you, David, for that, and Ray as well. So that presents a really, I think, practical framework for people in our audience to start thinking about being people-centered in their AI implementations within their organizations. And as David mentioned, we do have a final poll for our audience before we get into some questions for Ray and David. So that question is, what are the biggest barriers to adoption of AI in your organization? Is it assembling the expertise needed for AI, assembling the data needed, or being willing to adapt and work differently? So we'll give everyone a chance to respond. David and Ray, again, what are some of your thoughts here? I'm sure there's in some ways some combinations of different barriers, but is there one that you feel is very common right now in organizations?
I can start. I'll tell you that the hardest part right now is really assembling the expertise. That's the part where we see a lot of scarce resources. The data is out there. It's a question of having the right data. But I don't want to bias what people are going to do in the poll. And then the third one is the one that people don't think about a lot. The third one is something that people don't think about is the fact that you do actually have to work differently. So I'm going to be curious. But here's the thing: not everybody can get to the data.
My perception is exactly what Ray said, is that oftentimes expertise is hard. The data is out there, but I will say that a lot of organizations don't realize how stovepipe their data is in their organizations and or locked up in legacy IT systems. So the data's there, but it may not be in a form that's readily
exactly
for AI. And then I think the last thing I would say is change is hard. Everybody says they want change unless it actually involves them changing. Or I've seen many places where I parachute in an organization, they say, we want you to be innovative, just don't disrupt anything. And you're like,
Which can be
exactly
complicated. So our results are in, and I think it is fascinating that this poll has the most spread out results we're seeing, with 34% of our audience feeling that the expertise, as Ray touched on, is right now a major barrier. 21% are saying that their data, so maybe they have the data and it's not in the best shape, or maybe it isn't gathered yet. And then 44%, so our winner in this poll, is actually being willing to adapt and work differently. So I think that does speak to what you were both just mentioning, that it is a major change and paradigm shift to be adopting some of these processes and ways of working in organizations. So that concludes our introduction to this topic and our initial presentation, but let's continue the discussion with our Q&A portion. So we've received lots of great questions from our audience, and we'll continue to take questions for the remainder of the hour. We have about 18 minutes, so we'll try to get through as many as we can. A reminder that you can submit your questions by entering them into the questions module. And to start off, we did have several questions pop up that were about sort of action and pushing against the status quo that might be happening in an organization. So how can individuals within a company who want their organization to be more people-centered about data and AI elevate these ideas and approaches to senior leadership? So I'll leave that to Ray or David, whoever wants to kick this off.
You want me? Well, of course, Ray, you're pointing that way. You're assuming I'm on that side on my screen, but I'm pointing at me. So I think the first thing you need to do is you need to identify what are the strengths, but also the weaknesses in the organization that you are trying to help embrace this change. And I find the easiest way to do that, just start off with, if you're not in a position where you are specifically tasked to do this, but you're choosing to do this, organize some very informal brown bags within your own company. Do some informal lunch and learns, and ask people what they're thinking. Engage them using Socratic questions. Listen as much as you can, because that will tell you where are people excited, where you have those early adopters, but also the conversations may either overtly tell you where their concerns or fears, or the people that aren't present will tell you something as well, because I've seen many an innovative effort say, you know what, we went off and we went with only the people that were excited, and we left out the people that were naysayers. And I'm like, that's not going to work well, because if you lead out the people that are naysayers early on, when you try to bring back your innovative effort to the rest of the company, you will either get shot, or it will just never reattach back to the mothership. So I think the first thing is to ever do is do informal listening and learning tours, whether it's through lunches, whether it's through formal meetings, but do whatever you can to assess the strengths and weaknesses of the organization prior to doing the AI implementation.
Let's just go to the next question. That was an awesome answer.
All right, you can get the next one, Ray.
Well, terrific. Sorry, I was muted there for a second, but I think that's really helpful. And like I said, that question kind of surfaced in several different questions, so I hope that's helpful for our audience. And another one to pivot here a little bit more back towards our ethics conversation. So we did have some specific questions about initiatives and guidelines that are already sort of coming into for instance, the European Union has ethic guidelines for trustworthy AI. One of our participants asked, how do you think we can, despite different stakeholder interests, successfully implement these into binding laws and decisions in organizations, and how will ethics sort of play a role there?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, right? When we think about the EU guidelines on AI as example, right, they're similar to this, right? It's about having human agency and oversight, which means you begin something with a human, you end a process with a human, right? There's also some aspect of making sure it's safe, right? And they also talk about, transparency, diversity along the way. And so I think it's going to be subject to a lot of different, like if data sits in a certain region, or if a transaction is working with a certain set of citizens, unfortunately, we're going to have to get that level granularity in the future, because every country is going to try to legislate some level of their version of ethics in AI. And so the people-centered design principles that we're talking about today are probably going to be universal in the mega set of ethics, but there are going to be things that are a little bit more granular that we might not account for. And you may see that in different regions in terms of their perspectives on what their expectations of artificial intelligence will do.
And agree emphatically with what Ray just said. I mean, the reason why we give people the Auris framework that includes what are your obligations will vary based on the markets you're operating in. As already mentioned, if you're in Europe, you obviously have GDPR, which obviously is asking you to respect the person's actual proactive consent. You can't assume consent, it must be proactive consent to use the data for purposes involving AI. At the same time, if you're operating in China, they've actually indicated that starting fairly soon, whether it's going to be December or January, to have data that is not available to the government is actually going to be illegal, which obviously is the complete 180 from Europe. And so we spell out the Auris framework to say, what are your obligations to society based on the markets and the societies in which you're operating, because it will vary based on the different laws that different countries and regions have.
Terrific. That's very helpful. And I think one other area that goes back to the framework, and I think something that you were touching on, David, about having data advocates within organizations that aren't necessarily only technical roles or, involved in the creation of some of these algorithms or systems. We did have some questions around then, what are maybe tools or methods that people who aren't software engineers or technically, capable of creating these systems be mindful of and maybe be aware of when it comes to detecting bias in an algorithm or something that might have negative implications for down the road?
Sure, I'll tackle it first, and then Ray, you can add on. I would say the first step you need to always ask is, does this even pass a human test, which is, if I had to answer this question, would this data set be informative enough that if I sat down with pen and paper and enough time, would I be able to answer this question? So does it make sense to be using this data set to be answering this question? If not, then I think that begins to raise a red flag, which is, why are you somehow trying to correlate X with Y if it doesn't make sense? But then two, you need to begin to dive a little bit deeper and say, if it makes sense to use that data set, how was this data collected? is it, can I look at the representativeness of if it involves people, were for some reason were Native Americans left out, or were minority groups left out, or were people of certain ages more involved than others? And so ask whoever you can to say, give me the different sort of sections of the data to show, is it representative of the society, or am I seeing a skewing where unfortunately maybe it's all white males or something like that, in which case I've got a problem. So first assess for, does it make sense to be using the data? Two, make sense as to, is it representative of the questions you're trying to ask? And then the third thing is, what are your checks to make sure you are comfortable with the decisions that are coming out of how the AI is using this data? For example, the AI may eventually come to the conclusion that, heaven forbid, but it may say that people of a certain type are more at risk of defaulting on loans. Well, that may be something that the data shows, but it doesn't mean ethically that you should then target certain groups for higher percentage loans or something like that, because that's not ethically right, even if that's what the data is showing. And there may be other reasons why. It may be because that's just how things have been historically. Doesn't mean that's a predictor of the future, but you need to recognize that just because the data shows a correlation does not mean you should act on that if it goes against your principles as a society and as an organization.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this can be done non-technically, because if you've got the ability to rigorously challenge your assumptions and understand any cognitive biases or pattern biases, that's not a technical function. That's really about you being able to be critical and being able to do some critical analysis. Right? If you've been in analytics roles or critical analyst roles, you're trying to figure out, is the bias coming from the source? Is someone trying to influence you in a different way? Right? Is that data even actually accurate? Right? Is there potential that that data was fake? Right? Those are things that are non-technical.
Terrific. I think that's very helpful. And yeah, I think something that when people think about it from, a human standpoint, answering that question themselves from their own, guideline of ethics within their organization, that frames it in a way that feels approachable. So one other question we did have that got maybe into it was surfacing in a lot of different questions, was that the idea of once this idea has passed and has, senior leadership has bought into this idea of doing more people-centered AI, where do you start, and what do some practical examples look like right now for these types of implementations?
You want to go first, Ray, or do you want me to?
Sure. I was going to say that, if you apply these design principles and run a test against those design principles and building it, then I think the next part really is what David was talking about in the last three areas. It's really the culture and the change that's behind, right? And I think that's where the training around data advocates becomes very, very important, because what those data advocates are doing is they're actually spreading the word. They're actually carrying on the culture, but they're also doing it in a way that's important for each organization. Right? And having those data advocates is important, but doing it on its own, you still have to monitor what's happening, right? To make sure that you're not going astray or not going in the wrong way. And I think that those two things work very, very well with each other. And then the third part, where it's talking about bounded expectations, I think that is important, because that gives you some guardrails as to what to start to test. But I believe it's going to get harder and harder as you expand out to larger areas that go closer to narrow AI, where we're actually making decisions. And because for this one reason, the precision of decisions is going to be super important. 99% accuracy in manufacturing, we're like, yeah, this is great, it's going to be okay. 99% accuracy in healthcare, I don't know about that. Right. So I think that's kind of where we're going to see some of those limitations. But it's important that people do not get frustrated, because the curve, and I don't know which direction, oh yeah, we'll do it this way. The curve is actually going to look like this, and then it's really going to ramp up pretty hard in terms of the return. But the problem is, somewhere along the way, it does dip. You're putting more money in than you're getting any ROI out of. But that's okay, because that's part of the training piece. To get to that level of precision and decisions is going to be hard.
And I think what Ray hit the nail on the head is that it really has to be a conversation that says, if people are in it to do this right and well, it needs to be approached as an experimental learning activity. And so I wouldn't make it your I wouldn't take everything you're currently doing and stop doing them to do AI. You should keep on doing what you're doing, but have AI as a parallel effort because, as Ray mentioned, there is going to be a period of learning. There's going to be a period of diminished returns before you start seeing then that exponential gain where it actually benefits the organization. And so framing that expectation internally, but also externally is key. And also, again, we've talked about the data advocates, all these steps we put for you, they're all good. The first thing I would actually recommend is, as quickly as possible, work with your board and your leadership to put together that Auris framework, even if it's just draft, because you're going to eventually face some challenges where you're going to have to make a decision. I've seen cases in the past where, let's say you're doing something that involves public, people can provide comments or data, and unfortunately some people post comments that are either nonsensical, maybe they're inflammatory, they're not really contributing to the conversation, but then you have the question of, do you remove them or not? And some people might say, well, you're removing them because they're inflammatory or they're not helpful, but then other people say, well, wait, that's censoring or that's limiting speech or something like that. If you can plant that flag early and say, here's what we perceive our obligations are. For example, our obligations are to hear everybody, even if we disagree with them or we don't understand what they're saying, that makes it easier to be more proactive as opposed to reactive to what's happening. And so having that Auris framework as you move forward in that always be learning mode of doing an AI implementation, I think it's so key because there will be unexpected things that happen, but being able to at least be grounded in saying, here's how we've chosen to position ourselves as a company and as an organization, it'll sort of serve as your North Star as you move towards that final goal.
Terrific. That's really helpful. And one quick question that it jogged my memory when Ray touched on the example of narrow AI. Just for our audience, because this did come up early in the presentation, could you give a quick summary of the difference between general AI and narrow AI?
Sure. So I'll do it. Yeah. So narrow AI. So the challenge of most AI systems right now is they're fairly brittle beyond the domain in which they've been trained. And so with expert systems, you can create a system that's as good, if not better, than the top 5% of doctors in the world with cardiovascular disease or diseases of the eye or cancer detection. But then the moment you try and shift to something that's maybe, something about the lungs or about muscles, the AI just falls apart because it's just not been trained in that. And so the holy grail of sports, the metaphorical holy grail that everyone's looking for, is a system that is not just narrowly trained on whatever specific data it's been exposed to, but much like a human, it can have a much more diverse conversation. So it can switch from not just different medical topics, but then suddenly if you decide to ask it about, how about that sporting event or how about that stock return or something like that, it can have a fairly robust conversation and provide insights across a wide range of topics as opposed to just a narrow range of topics.
And one of the things that's going to happen over time is you're going to have a bunch of narrow AI capabilities that get aggregated that become part of your general AI. And so it's all working towards that. But I think it's really important to understand that certain tasks are so different than others. It's about putting those together. I mean, it makes you wonder like how the human brain actually works. I mean, it's unbelievable how we can do so many things. Wow.
And what you actually hit the nail on the head is that there's actually a new theory coming out that actually, while we think we have one conscious voice that makes up our brain, there's actually probably many, and that really what it's this illusion of a conscious voice. And so it may very well be the solution to general AI may be to have many different narrow AIs and then some bridging function across all of them in the future.
Well, something at least to filter the voices in my head. Oh, I mean the AI model, yeah.
Yeah, as long as we don't get that brain-computer interface for social media, I think we're all good. So everything's good.
You got a malfunction. You're hearing more voices than you normally do. What does that mean?
Well, this has been fantastic, David and Ray. I really enjoyed. First, I really enjoyed your article, and having worked with you both on this, I've personally learned so much more about where AI is right now within organizations and this really helpful framework for thinking about how we can be more people-centered in our approach so that the projects that do get off the ground within organizations are, really working for all stakeholders involved. So that's actually all the time we have for today's Q&A session. So over the next few days, please look out for a feedback survey that we'll be sending via email. And we greatly appreciate your thoughts and opinions. So also a reminder that the recording for this program and the slides will be available within 3 to 4 business days. So look for an email with that. And that finally concludes our program. Thank you for attending. Thank you so much to our presenters, Ray Wang and David Bray, and thank you again to our sponsor, SAS.